This is an excerpt from the beginning of Chapter 3 of my book, Dick Waterman A Life in Blues. At the end of Chapter 2, there is a recounting how Dick and a colleague had pooled their resources to book Mississippi John Hurt to perform for a week at the Cafe Yana. Encouraged by the success of the Cafe Yana performances, Dick soon embarked on another venture. In April 1964, he and a partner booked a show with a Delta blues musician, Booker White. White had been rediscovered in Memphis in 1963, the same year as John Hurt's rediscovery, by Ed Denson and John Fahey. He was the cousin of Riley King, who became legendary blues performer B.B. King. They scheduled Booker to perform for 3 nights at the YMCA on Huntington Avenue in Boston. Unfortunately, this endeavor proved less successful than the Mississippi John Hurt performances. The revenue covered little more than their expenses. Despite being financially unsatisfying, this set in motion an unlikely series of events that became a turning point in Dick's life and a catalyst for a new career. White needed a place to stay while in town, so Phil Spiro and Alan Wilson happily volunteered to host him at what Spiro described as their rat trap Cambridge apartment. Spiro remembers, "Between the two of us, Al and I had a single fork and no dishes, and we could not afford a telephone. Any spare cash went into records, and we had few of those. For us, seeing Booker White play in the here and now in Boston in 1964 seemed not at all possible. Yet it was, and we were there." While at the apartment with White one day, David Evans, an undergraduate at Harvard, and Wilson played tapes of blues music and discussed with Booker the music and musicians. Evans turned the topic of conversation to Son House. White mentioned that his friend, blues singer Lillian Memphis Mulroney Glover, had seen House exiting a movie theater in Memphis the previous year. They were astounded by this revelation because Son House had vanished from public view over 2 decades earlier. No one was certain if he was still alive. When Spiro returned home that evening, Wilson enthusiastically related White's comments that House had been seen in Memphis. Son House, a Delta blues musician, had made a few commercial recordings in Grafton, Wisconsin in 1930. In 1941 and 1942, he was recorded again by Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress. Few were familiar with his music outside the region where he lived, for his recordings certainly had not brought him great fame. The early recordings by House and other blues artists eventually made their way into the hands of devoted collectors of 78 RPM records. These originals were used by the companies of Origin Jazz Library, also known as OJL, and Records, Books, and Film Sales, also known as RBF, to create reissue LPs, which led to greater appreciation for both the artists and recordings by folk and blues enthusiasts. Even so, the audience for such music was limited. Spiro explains, "In spring 1964, House's name and music were unknown outside of a small number of people who knew of his few Library of Congress cuts from the 1940s, and the smaller group of country blues fans who collected 78s or who bought the reissues of country blues 78s on LPs from RBF and OJL. Al and I belonged to this last group, all reissue LPs and heavily indebted to the record collectors for our information about the music we loved and the people who had played it some 30 years earlier. There were certainly excellent contemporary blues musicians like Fred McDowell, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Big Joe Williams, Robert Pete Williams, and John Lee Hooker, and we liked their music as well. But the old 78s had mysteries, voices from the past, which were often more compelling than an LP recorded last month or last year. Before the OJL reissue LPs came out, I doubt that there were more than 100 people worldwide who had heard of Son House as a musician, and by the time we found him, that number might have doubled or tripled thanks to the OJL reissues. Intrigued, Spyro made some telephone calls. He contacted Lillian Glover, and although she did not know where House was currently residing, she confirmed White's story. White and John Hurt had been rediscovered the previous year, so perhaps Son House was still alive. Some vacation days from work, youthful exuberance, and a desire to meet one of his music icons result in plans for a road trip. Spyro occasionally saw Dick at local coffee houses and was aware of his interest in folk music. Knowing he was a journalist and photographer, Spyro decided to invite Dick to accompany him on the trip. Although Dick certainly had heard the music of many folk and blues artists, he was not familiar with House's music. He viewed the invitation as a rare opportunity for a news story. As he was still freelancing for the National Observer, he approached his editor with the idea and was told, "If you find him, you've got a story. If you don't find him, there's no story." Dick then notified Manny Greenhill that he would be out of the office for a few days. Al Wilson was an obvious choice as an additional traveling companion, but he was a struggling musician with a performance already scheduled at Club 47, which he was unwilling to cancel. Spyro called Tom Hoskins, who had rediscovered Mississippi John Hurt. Although Hoskins had no interest in the trip, he suggested an acquaintance from New York, Nick Pearls, mentioning that Pearls had both a car and a tape recorder. Despite the fact that neither of them knew Pearls, Spyro contacted him. Pearls was interested and provided their transportation in the form of a red Volkswagen Beetle. He had an enviable collection of 78 RPMs and reel-to-reel blues tapes, along with a large Ampex tape recorder and microphones that he brought along on the trip to capture the music by any willing blues musicians they encountered. Unfortunately, issues of personal incompatibilities emerged almost immediately. Dick recalls, "Pearls had gone to a few colleges and was in his 20s. His parents were very rich, and he just smoked dope and listened to blues. We spent 2 weeks in a Volkswagen together, so we got to know each other pretty well. I hated Pearls by the time we reached the Lincoln Tunnel. He made racist remarks. He was just arrogant and spoiled." Since Booker White's friend had reported seeing Son House in Memphis, this was their initial destination. Otherwise, there was little prior planning. Spyro says of their impromptu journey, "We had a lead to a great musician who hadn't been heard from in 20-odd years, and we thought it worth a few weeks' time out of our lives to follow it up, just to see what would happen. We were in our 20s, an age when you will follow hot tips just for the hell of it, as indeed we did, but we were not complete fools. We were looking for a person, and were not out for a career for him or for us. Thanks to Dick, Son did get a career, and Dick built a career for himself, and so, in his way, did Nick. But none of that had been in the air when we started out. We certainly had the specific goal of finding Son, but that's as far as it went. We had no idea how old he might be, or what kind of health he might be in, or if he still had all 10 fingers, or if he had gone over to religion and forsaken music entirely. And even if he had been seen in Memphis in 1963, he might not still be alive in 1964. Just finding him was the goal. We'd have been happy to meet him and shake his hand and be on our way if it came to that." Dick also admits, "I didn't know what we were going to do if we found him or didn't find him. We just weren't thinking that far ahead." In the mid-20th century, locating an individual was often a painstaking process. Many living in impoverished areas had no telephone. In some instances, the only method of finding someone was to simply ask people if they knew or had seen the individual and where they could be found. In Memphis, the trio was directed to the homes of 2 elderly blues musicians, Will Shade and Furry Lewis. Upon arrival, they encountered an environment far removed from that to which they were accustomed. Despite racial tensions, neither Lewis nor Shade seemed apprehensive about admitting the 3 young strangers into their home. Dick recalls, "They knew that if they played some music, they would get some money. We didn't have much money, maybe $5 or $10, but enough to buy a bottle of whiskey. We just got in on the local blues scene in Memphis. We never felt we were in any danger, but the slums of Memphis were just ghastly. It was so hot. We were in the black community in Memphis with Furry Lewis, who had recorded blues, and Will Shade of the Memphis Jug Band. We met Furry at his house on Beale Street and 4th, which was really a slum. It was the next building over from Will Shade's, who was very famous in the 1920s in the Memphis Jug Band. He was the leader, vocalist, and songwriter. He and his wife, Jenny Shade, were in real poverty. She'd been one of the most beautiful women in the 1920s, and Will Shade had won her over and married her. Now, 40 years later, she was just an old shrunken lady who sat in a rocking chair and chain-smoked Pall Malls and dropped the butts in a Maxwell House coffee can. She sipped Calvert's whiskey out of a coffee mug. She didn't say a single word all the time we were there. We interviewed him, and he played a few songs for us. When we left, Phil and I each took out a $5 bill and put it in his hand. He thanked us, and we thanked him. As we were leaving, Nick was driving, Phil was in the passenger seat, and I was in the back. Pearls said, "You gave him money, didn't you? I saw you give him money." I said, "Well, yeah. He gave us his time and his music. $10 really isn't a lot of money." Nick said, "You guys missed the point. You don't understand. It isn't what he gave us, it's what we gave him. We gave him immortality. We recorded his music. His music will live forever because long after he's dead, we have these tapes of his music. He just gave us a few minutes out of a night that he wasn't doing anything anyway." I looked at Phil, and Phil looked at me, and we just couldn't say anything beyond that. They met with Lillian Glover because she was their initial source of information regarding House's whereabouts. They also contacted Reverend Robert Wilkins, who had known House earlier in his career. Wilkins was a country blues musician who had recorded in the 1920s and became an ordained minister in the 1930s. He had been rediscovered in Memphis in the early 1960s by Dick and Louisa Spotswood and then booked to perform at various festivals. Spyro found his name in the Memphis telephone directory and placed a call to him that met with a favorable reception. Arrangements were made to visit him at his home on Macklemore Avenue. They soon arrived at his house, which was situated in a middle-class African-American neighborhood with impeccably clean lawns and streets. They were delighted when he agreed to join in their search, and ultimately he proved a fortuitous addition. He was from the area, had friends there, and knew people who remembered House. Spyro credits Reverend Wilkins' participation as a key factor in the success of their trip. Spyro comments, "Everyone we met who had known Son in those days was glad to help us locate him once they had decided to trust us. Son appeared to have left only goodwill behind him after he left Mississippi. With Reverend Wilkins' presence as our bona fides, we were able to tap into that goodwill. Without him, we encountered a moderate degree of mistrust that was appropriate to the situation." Their trip coincided with the increasing unrest of the civil rights movement. Despite the turmoil, Dick and his friends were not fearful for their own safety, perhaps because they did not fully grasp the potential implications for their own lives. Dick remembers, "The mistreatment of Negroes in the 1960s was certainly well known. If you were in folk music, this fact was well established. I think we were just feeling that nothing bad was going to happen to us. That was their conflict. We weren't involved. We weren't integrating or registering voters. We were looking for bluesmen. It was a little naive, but in the long run, that's how it worked out. We were protected by our own foolishness." Spyro's assessment is similar. "We certainly encountered a level of hostility from local white people, but not as much as I had anticipated before the trip. I had lived in New York until age 10 and went to unsegregated schools there. But I had also lived in Miami from ages 10 through 17, and segregation was a way of life there as much as any other place in the South in the 1950s. Thus, I was expecting problems, but nothing like what was actually going on elsewhere in Mississippi while we were there. I had thought about the issue beforehand and had felt that looking for a black musician to record was nothing new to Southern whites and would be an acceptable situation. Luckily, we never had to put that questionable idea to much of a test. If we were not in direct danger ourselves, it was still a very dangerous time and place, and we were fortunate not to have run into serious trouble. It was pure dumb luck. They stayed in the suburbs of Memphis and made a short drive into Robinsonville and Tunica, Mississippi each day, accompanied by Reverend Wilkins, who served as a buffer between them and the local residents. They drove down rough, dusty roads and plodded through cotton fields in the sweltering heat of the Mississippi summer. They carried tape recordings of bluesmen such as Charlie Patton, Robert Johnson, Skip James, and Son House to play for the people they encountered, asking if they had heard of the performers or if they knew House's whereabouts. Despite the heat, humidity, and dusty rural settings, Reverend Wilkins always was impeccably dressed and stalwart. Each day he met them attired in a dress shirt, tie or bow tie, suspenders, trousers, and a jacket, his eyes peering out through gold-rimmed glasses. Spyro and Waterman took their places in the back seat while Pearls drove, and Reverend Wilkins navigated the route from the passenger seat, an act that was potentially dangerous to everyone in the vehicle given the racially charged climate. Wilkins also was the one who stepped out of the car to hold conversations when they needed information from local residents. Dick recounts, "One time there was a pickup truck stopped and two white guys were standing outside of it talking. We stopped and Wilkins got out and stood up and talked across the Volkswagen to them. He said, 'I'm looking for the house or store of X,' and they looked at him and went back to talking. Wilkins repeated the question and they looked at him longer and then went back to talking to each other again. Wilkins just looked at them and said, 'Look-a-here, I'm talking to you.' And he repeated his question. They turned around and stared at him, and he stared back at them. They told him what he wanted to know, he nodded his head, and got back in the car. He was like that. He was not going to be intimidated or ignored. I don't really remember having a lot of hostility. These white people obviously held this well-dressed black man in contempt, but Wilkins had very erect posture, and as a minister he was not going to talk up to anyone. He was used to being treated as an equal, and he demanded that. He was very forthright, not confrontational, but he just stood up straight, looked you in the eye, and demanded an answer. Finally, their efforts yielded a potential clue to House's whereabouts. One of the musicians they met and recorded while in Mississippi was Fiddlin' Joe Martin. He was a direct link to House since he had performed with House in the 1930s, and they had been recorded together by Alan Lomax on his trip to the Delta in 1941. Martin urged them to contact a man named Benjamin Brown Sr. They visited Brown in a Memphis hospital, and he verified Martin's information that his son, Benjamin Brown Jr., had once been married to House's stepdaughter, and that his son might know how to contact her. Martin located the son and accompanied them on their visit with him. Indeed, Benjamin Brown Jr. knew the name of the mother of the man to whom his ex-wife was married and directed them to her. She, in turn, informed them that her son and daughter-in-law resided in Detroit and offered their telephone number. Since Dick stuttered and Spyro was more knowledgeable about blues artists and music, they decided Spyro should place the call. When she answered, he explained they were searching for Son House and asked if she knew him. She said, "Yes, he's married to my mother. He's my stepfather." With increasing excitement, he asked if she had seen them recently and learned that they had visited with her in Detroit 2 or 3 years earlier. The foremost concern was whether House was still alive, and if so, where he was residing. They learned he was living with his wife, Evie, in Rochester, New York. Spyro requested his telephone number, but he was told they did not have a phone. She said their friend, James Jim Knox, had a phone, and he brought them to his house whenever they needed to make a call. Before ending the conversation, he asked for House's address and Knox's telephone number. Assuming Knox was a next-door neighbor, they sent a telegram to House with their telephone number and asked if he would make a collect call to them. No call ever came because the telegram was incorrectly addressed. After waiting for a while, they contacted Knox. Once more, they explained the reason for their call. Knox confirmed that he knew House, and Spiro inquired when last he had seen House, and he replied, "Oh, it was early yesterday afternoon." They were elated. They asked if he would mind to bring House to his home so that they might call again the following day and speak with him. Knox agreed. Anxiously, they waited another 24 hours and called again. But their excitement quickly gave way to disappointment as Knox admitted he had forgotten about the call. Spiro impressed upon him their need to talk with House. Once again, he asked if Knox would help, and when he agreed, Spiro said he would call again an hour later. Dick recalls, "We knew he was E. House, so there was the assumption that it was Eugene House. So Phil said, 'Is this Eugene House?' And he said, 'No.' Phil said, 'We're looking to find son House, the one who recorded for Paramount, the one who knew Robert Johnson, the one who knew Charlie Patton, the one who recorded for Alan Lomax and the Library of Congress at Clarksdale in the early 1940s. Are you that son House?' So he said, 'Say, who is this anyway?' And then he said, 'Yeah, that's me. I done them things.'" Understandably, House was both surprised and perplexed by the question since he had left behind his life as a musician decades earlier. Phil asked if he still played guitar, and he responded that he could, although it had been some years since he had last played. Knowing he was alive and living in Rochester, all that remained to complete their journey was to meet him in person. They asked for his address, told him that they would leave immediately, and asked him not to go anywhere until they arrived. The day they made contact with House was noteworthy for multiple reasons. Dick recalls, "That was Sunday, June 21st, 1964. It was Father's Day, and it was the day that Jim Bunning pitched a perfect game for the Phillies against the Mets, which was very rare. It was also the day civil rights activists Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were let out of jail in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and murdered." The trio quickly loaded into the Volkswagen and departed that same day from Memphis, bound for Rochester. Based on information they had received while in Mississippi about another old bluesman, Skip James, they decided to try a route that would take them through Poplar Bluff, Missouri, to search for James. Upon arrival in Poplar Bluff, they spent the day searching for anyone who could provide information about him or his whereabouts. When their inquiries yielded no results, they realized their information had been erroneous and resumed their journey to New York. On the evening of Tuesday, June 23rd, they arrived in Rochester. The area was a modest, middle-class African-American neighborhood with several apartment houses interspersed with patches of grass and trees. Dick recalls, "The apartment house had a low stone wall. A well-dressed man in a white shirt and tie and his wife in a neat dress were sitting there by the wall. We said, 'Is this 61 Grieg Street?' They replied, 'Yeah, it is.' 'Do son House and his wife live on the 4th floor?' 'Yeah, they do.' 'Okay, thank you.' So we walked on by and the man said, 'But he ain't up there now.' 'Really? How do you know?' He looked at me and smiled and said, 'Because I'm him.' At that point, I set my camera and gave it to Mrs. House. There's a photo of son with the three of us, which she took with my camera. The group walked upstairs to the house's sparsely furnished but meticulously tidy apartment and played some of the recordings of Skip James, Robert Johnson, and House's old friend Charlie Patton. He recognized Johnson and Patton and reminisced a bit about the latter, but did not recollect ever hearing James's music. They played some of his 1930 Grafton recordings, but he did not recognize them as his own. Dick recalls, he listened to it with some interest. Then he said to us, "That guy got some of my words." Miss House said, "That's you." And I said, "Yeah, that's you with Paramount." in Grafton, Wisconsin in 1930. That was a real knee slapper to him. He said, "Yeah, that's me, baby, me and Charlie." Obviously, they were anxious to hear him play and sing. They wondered whether he would sound the same as he did on those old recordings. Initially, he declined their request to play, saying it had been a number of years since he had played. On their second day in town, they coaxed him into playing on a borrowed wooden guitar and recorded his efforts. His hands shook, and he asked if they would purchase a bottle of wine and bring it to him. They left and returned shortly with the bottle he had requested. His first attempts were ragged and halting. Dick remembers, as he drank, he got better. He hadn't played in many years, so he had no calluses. He was playing this very lightweight, flimsy wooden guitar. He played so forcefully, so aggressively, attacking the instrument. He was having trouble fretting with his left fingers, so we put the slide on, and he was much better. He would start a song and clear his voice several times, and ultimately he found his register, that low, heavy, majestic voice. He played, and of course, not being musical, I didn't know what I had in front of me. Pearls knew because he had the original Library of Congress recordings, and Phil played blues guitar, so they realized that although he hadn't played in many years, the essence of it was there. I'll tell you, when he sang, he filled up that room. We were in his living room, and that deep, rich Delta voice was pretty awesome stuff. They spent the night in Rochester and then drove to House's apartment for a final visit the following day. He performed for them again, and having played the previous day, his dexterity was slightly improved. The next morning, they began the trip home, tired but elated at having located and met Son House during a 10-day adventure none of them could have predicted.